So the next thing that, we want to say, and that you argue in line with the majority in Reformed theology, is for, what we could call something like unequal,
Hmm.
double predestination, right? Or we could say asymmetrical. It sees asymmetry between election and reprobation. So if we think about the doctrine of predestination, it's kind of two pieces: positively election, negatively reprobation. Why is this distinction important and critical? Especially if we're thinking about, you're kind of thinking about God's justice, now maybe his character more generally, where people will struggle with this. It's not an easy thing to think about or to wrestle with, right? And sometimes the challenge really is for people to see what Scripture says about these things and embrace what Scripture says about who God is. So it's important that we wrestle through these things, but not always easy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So the asymmetry between election and reprobation, I think, is really important. Not just because it's not something that Reformed theologians came to in order to make these teachings more palatable, right? That's not
Yeah.
that's not the goal. The goal is to be true to what the Scripture teaches, and the Scripture really does describe these two, decrees as being different in some very important ways, right? And so that's where the idea of asymmetry comes in. It's an attempt to be true to actually what the biblical authors are saying and
Yeah.
teaching. And it's also very important to locate the asymmetry properly, right? So the asymmetry doesn't have to do with God's sovereignty, for example. It's not like God is more sovereign over election than he is over reprobation, right? I think
Yeah, that's right.
kind of went over there. Yeah, both of these decrees are made really at the end of the day for God's own sovereign purposes and not in response to foreseen merits or foreseen faith or anything like that. Nevertheless, the biblical authors do describe an asymmetry that, a couple different asymmetries that are really important in helping us understand God's attitudes towards the reprobate and the elect. So for example, there's asymmetry in terms of, his view of what he's producing in election versus what he's producing in reprobation, right? So to just expand on that in a little bit. With election, God is pleased with everything that is being brought into effect in time through his decree of election, right? So when he decrees that a particular individual would be the recipient of saving grace, God is pleased when he brings the gospel to these individuals, and through the
Yeah.
power of his Spirit, he affects faith in them. That faith that's affected in them is pleasing to the Lord. When they begin to bear the fruit of obedience in keeping with their faith, that obedience is in and of itself pleasing to the Lord. When they receive the final fruit of their faith, when they receive their final reward, the joy that they have, the salvation that they have, that is in and of itself pleasing to the Lord. So election brings about this set of, this entire range of effects in time that are all pleasing to the Lord in and of themselves. Reprobation is different in the way that it's described, right? So in reprobation, it's not the case that God is pleased with the reprobate's unbelief or pleased with their lives of disobedience, their lack of their wickedness. And God is not pleased in their suffering in and of itself, right? So when the fruit of reprobation, the full fruit finally kind of comes to bear, and these individuals experience God's just punishments for their sins for eternity, God is not pleased with their suffering, right? Even though God is pleased with the demonstration of his justice and the vindication of his glory and the vindication of his name.
Yeah.
Right? So that is an asymmetry there, where, on the one hand, God takes pleasure in the fruits of election in and of themselves, whereas in reprobation, God takes pleasure in the demonstration of his justice, his power, his glory, his vindication, while, the kind of fruits of reprobation in and of themselves are not pleasing to the Lord. Those are more just a means to, the good end of demonstrating his power and his justice and his goodness, holiness, right? So So there's an asymmetry there. Yeah. And then there's also an asymmetry in God's kind of involvement in bringing about the effects of these decrees in time. So with the elect, God is, through his Spirit, kind of pouring into them something that's foreign to their sinful nature, but which accords with his own holy nature, right? So when the Spirit, works in the elect to produce the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, right? The Spirit is bringing something, he's working in the elect, something that's foreign to the elect's sinful, nature. It's not something
Yeah.
that's about just, left by themselves, right? And that fruit, the way that Paul describes it, and he says it's the fruit of the Spirit, I think he's not only saying that the Spirit is the source of these things, which, he is saying, but I think he's saying that these things are reflections of the Spirit's own character, right?
Yeah.
So in the elect, you see something of God's character being produced in the elect. Reprobation is not that way. It's the opposite,
Yeah.
right? Where God is not imparting anything of his nature in the reprobate. Instead, he's working completely with the reprobate's own nature, right? And the reprobate are producing in their lives that which accords with their own sinful nature rather than with God's holy nature, right? So God is not imparting anything foreign to them. He's in fact kind of working completely with that which accords with the reprobate's own nature and is produced by the reprobate's own nature, even though all of that is taking place in accordance with God's providential orchestration of all things. So that's another really important asymmetry. So we see that God's holiness, goodness is completely upheld throughout this, throughout his work of bringing his decrees, their effects in time.
Yeah, that's helpful. And, maybe here too, there are some that argue for kind of single predestination, right? The idea that God chooses the saved but has no decree, regarding the lost. Why do you think that is not logical or really possible if we have a biblical view of election and not this flip side of reprobation, even though we want to affirm, the asymmetry of this double predestination?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, there are good, faithful brothers and sisters who, in their reading of scripture, they come to the conclusion that, predestination only has to do with the elect and it doesn't involve the reprobate. And, while I think I appreciate the arguments for this position, like I ultimately don't find it to be persuasive. I think because on the one hand, I think there are many texts that some of them we've already talked about that describe God as taking a more active role, I guess, if we put it that way, in the fates and fortunes of the reprobate as well. And so I think it's hard at least for me, to read particular passages like Romans 9 or 1 Peter 2, or even the Gospel of John's portrayal of Judas. It's hard for me to read texts like these and come to the conclusion that there was no, that there was no predestining work at play. So I think that the double predestinarian reading is just simply more true to the biblical texts.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that the doctrine of God's sovereignty sits kind of uneasily with a view of single predestination.
Yeah.
And single predestinarians are trying to take seriously the Bible's teaching regarding God's sovereignty over all things, even over human choices.
Sure.
And yet it's at the very least, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect, in my view, between the idea that God only predestines the elect versus the kind of sovereignty that the biblical authors repeatedly describe God as having, that he's sovereign over everything, not just, the lives of the elect, but the lives of it as well. To me, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect. And also, single predestinarians, the same charges that are leveled, or at least very similar charges that are leveled against double predestinarians, will be leveled against single predestinarians as well. And they have to make use of the same kinds of concepts that double predestinarians do in order to uphold, uphold genuine human responsibility and to uphold the goodness of God. So they're having to make use of, compatibilism and, kind of theories of causality and things like that.
Yeah.
And so they already have the resources.
Yeah.
available to them to use to maintain God's goodness in the face of, the decree of negative predestination as well. So I don't know. I don't think single predestination gets us to any sort of, it doesn't lead to any advantages, even if you want to think about it just in terms of
Sure.
a very pragmatic approach. And then finally, just logically, I'm not a philosopher and I'm not the son of a philosopher.
Yeah.
Claimed to be a philosopher, but it just doesn't seem very persuasive to me that God can choose some without deliberately not choosing others, right?
Yeah.
If you have the choice between A and B, and let's say I choose A, that is in effect me choosing not to choose B, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how you can get around that. The only way, I guess, is if I wasn't aware that B was there, right? But that's not available to us when it comes to describing God, because God is
that's right.
all-knowing. And so by virtue of choosing A for salvation, how can it be possible that God is not choosing to not choose B?
Yeah.
Maybe there's some philosophical way of rounding that square peg for me. But to me, it just seems difficult to maintain that God can deliberately choose to elect without also deliberately not choosing, or deliberately choosing not to choose
Yeah.
some.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.